to keep the presentation within 20 minutes and then open for at least 5 minutes if possible. So my name is Giacomo Vacca. I'm responsible for the network applications development in TruePhone Labs. I've been playing with Kamailio, FreeSwitch and ASIS for more than a decade actually. And more recently I'm playing with EJBD. And TruePhone, so it's a mobile operator. Our philosophy is that we hate roaming. So what we want to do is provide calls, messaging and data free or as cheap as possible. And TruePhone Labs is responsible and taking care of the mobile applications for iOS, Android and BlackBerry. We get the best open source applications from available, and Kamailio of course is one of them since the beginning. It was in fact open source in 2008. And we change them, we make them communicate in order to build the best possible user experience for our customers. We want to provide a phone in their mobile device. And we've also recently funded the WebRTC work for FreeSwitch. So let's get to the problem in this presentation. You have your Kamailio machine well configured and set up. You're happy with it. You want a new one, you want a second, and it's easy to configure. For example, you want a second one for redundancy or load balancing. And then you want a third one and perhaps a fourth in a different data center. And perhaps you need to apply a change one day, or the underlying operating system needs to be upgraded. And things start to become more complex. So you are basically facing a three-dimensional problem where you have what you think your configuration is, what the actual configuration is in your machine, which unfortunately I'm afraid to tell you typically they are not the same, and what you want the machine configuration to become. So the solution, we tried a few things in the past, and it was basically deploying a generic configuration in a machine and then customize it with some automatic scripts so that on each final configuration we had what we wanted. We had some part of manual configuration that we didn't like. Then we worked on extracting everything that changes from one box to the other so that we can have a generic, we can have a Kamailio configuration file which includes these defines and then a different defines file for each machine, which was a progress. And we also did something more extreme, like building one Debian package per machine containing the exact configuration for that box. So we have one Debian package for one version into Kamailio 1 on dev, for example, or Kamailio 2 on staging, or for the production box. The problem with that is that at the end of everything, we didn't have any automatic documentation. We had to write down our own documentation. So before speaking about Puppet, which has already been mentioned by Ruben in the IT Center presentation, I'm a little bit curious about how many of you are already using Puppet on production, which is a good number. And how many of you have heard about Puppet but are not using it yet? Cool, so there's a lot of interest. And how many of you have heard of anything related to Puppet, which could be Chef or CF Engine or perhaps Docker? Okay, cool. It would be nice to see these numbers next year. Let's talk a little bit about Puppet in itself. It's an open source configuration management tool. It's written in Ruby. It has a declarative language that allows you to define the final status of a machine. So not how you get there, but what's the final status of the machine you want to achieve. That doesn't mean that every time you run it, you are sure to obtain the same result, specifically, in particular, at the beginning of a configuration. But once you get the final configuration, you are safe to run it as many times as you want. And this is what they call as the idempotency property of Puppet. It's been designed initially as a master-slave configuration, but it can be used as a standalone mode, and in fact, it's the way we use it because there are some advantages that I can discuss with you. In my opinion, he has a flat learning curve. So if you haven't tried it, I suggest you try it because it's easy to learn. Just a little bit of definitions before going to the other slides. So when you write Puppet code in a file, you have a manifest. When you have a group of manifests that represent a specific entity, that could be, for example, Kamailio, you have a module. And what Puppet does with the modules is compiles them in something that can be executed, and when the compiled manifests are the catalogs. This is very trivial. So Puppet, we have a Puppet master in the master-slave configuration, which pulls the manifests from a Git repo, for example. And the Puppet agents are responsible for pulling the catalogs and run them into the target hosts. On the other hand, you have the standalone approach, which is ours, where each Puppet agent just pulls the manifests from a Git repo and generates the catalogs and executes them. Very quickly, the advantage of the Puppet master configuration is that you have a central control, a central point of control, which is also a disadvantage because it could be a single point of failure, and that you don't have to care too much about the Puppet configuration on the agent. And also, you don't have to connect the agents to the Git repo. The disadvantage, as I mentioned, is that it's possible that you have a single point of failure. You need to be sure that all these connections are secure, and you have to manage them, so it's more work. And yeah, that's pretty much. For what concerns the standalone approach instead, the advantage is that it's simple. You don't have a single point of failure. You don't have to manage the connections to the Puppet master, and you can just, it's basically the simplest thing you can imagine is a machine with Puppet running on it, pulling the Puppet manifests and executing them. The disadvantage is that you need to guarantee access to the Git repo on each box, and you may not want to do that on production or other environments. And the other disadvantage is that the Puppet configuration on each Puppet agent could be a little bit misaligned to the other box. So you have basically a second level problem when you have to be sure that the Puppet configuration is aligned when you are managing the configuration on your hosts. So this is an example of the simplest possible definition of a node in your infrastructure. So Puppet allows you to define environments. I'm sure you have the production environment, probably other, like testing, staging, pre-production, development, probably, perhaps many development environments. Each one for Puppet is a site, and each site has one or more nodes. Each node represents a host. And this is the simplest possible definition of an entire machine. So you tell Puppet, in this node, I want you to include this Puppet module, and when you run Puppet on that machine, it will install it for you. Puppet is a tool, but it's also a language. It's a declarative language, so you can do clever stuff with it. You can use regular expressions. You have conditional switches and other things provided by a language. And you can also add Ruby snippets on it if you want. If you want to do things that the Puppet APIs don't provide. The problem is, what I suggest is to keep the manifests as simple as possible. Try and work in extracting the data, the changes node by node, and keeping the manifests so that you can have the same module on each box, and what you change is only outside of the modules in the nodes definitions. And I've published this Puppet module for Kamailio, which should be available right now, which is a rudimentary way of having your first Kamailio deployment on a box. I tested it on Debian Wheezy and for Kamailio 4, and you may want to try it out. Trying to figure out the minimum amount of actions to have your Kamailio running on a box. I think these are the 4 that I've seen yesterday in many presentations, in many technical shops, which were a list of apt-get update or apt-get install, or changing the sources list of an apt installation. You can do this with Puppet. You can do this with Puppet. You can deploy your prerequisites on the host first of all. You can install the packages from an apt repository or RPM packages or whatever repository system you're using. On top of it, you install your configuration files, for example, of course, Kamailio CFG or TLS CFG, and then you define the service status, because you can tell that a specific machine can have Kamailio running, but you may want another machine for any reason to have Kamailio not running, and you can manage that with Puppet as well. Surrounding Kamailio, you may imagine as many things as you want. Don't worry about this part that you probably don't see at the end, because it's not important. This is just a list of whatever you may think of managing with Puppet in a host. And we, by the way, in TruePhone Labs, we manage everything with Puppet. We don't manage with Puppet. But in a Kamailio machine specifically, you can have the apt repositories, TCP keep alive, firewalls, Nagios checks, monit, set, log rotate. We are even managing these swap sites and swappiness, so whatever you can imagine. And if you play with Puppet and you write some modules, you may want to use Puppet links to verify that the Puppet code you are writing is compliant with the best practices that Puppet Labs is defining. So I prepared a video. I think it would be nice if you could take a look at it. It's just 3 minutes, and it's without any cuts. It's just the real-time video starting from an empty virtual machine. And these are the minimum amount of action you can put in place to move from something that you don't have into a running Kamailio instance. So you build your VM in any way you want. For example, we are using DigitalOcean at the moment. You SSH into it. You git clone the Puppet repo that I mentioned before. That Puppet, module that I put on GitHub has a testing node. So whatever, the only thing you have to do is you go into environments, test, manifests, nodes, and you define the name of your host in which you want to test it. But for the rest, you can just clone it from Git. You run Puppet in simulation mode, no, and Puppet will give you some information about what it would have done if it was running in that moment. This means that you have a clear idea whether you are, for example, missing some pre-requirements, or you don't have access to something that you need to have access to. When you're happy, you just run it and you have the real thing. As mentioned, you can run it or not, which is probably something that IT Center Ruben is doing. So I think I was quite relatively quick. The summary is that, in my opinion, automation is easy. So in fact, I don't think you have any excuse not to have automatic